This episode of the Juicebox Podcast contains frank discussion about alcohol. We also curse a lot, but it's beeped out. But I mean, it's still cursing. Like, you know, if I say f***, but it's beeped out like it just was, you can still tell I was saying f***. So, you know, consider that before you let your kids listen. Or if you're a little squeamish about stuff like that, consider it before you listen. But just know you're going to miss a fantastic conversation about real life issues surrounding type 1 diabetes. And I think if you're the parent of a child with type 1, this is the kind of stuff you're going to want to know for the future. If you're a kid right now experimenting with drinking, you definitely need to know this. And if you're just an adult who likes to get a little boozy, might as well learn from a pro. And this episode isn't completely about drinking. We still learn about the guest and their upbringing and where they're from and how they got to where they are. I'm not a monster. I didn't just start yelling booze and talk for an hour. Actually, this one's like an hour and a half, but that's not what happened. It's still the Juicebox Podcast you know and love. Nothing's different. For instance, you still shouldn't take anything you hear on the Juicebox Podcast as advice, medical or otherwise. And you should, of course, always consult a physician before making any changes to your healthcare plan or becoming bold with insulin. Tell you what though, we curse a lot, so if you like the cursing, it really starts to kick in around halfway, and then it's just motherfucker this and shit and f*** you. Actually, there's not a lot of that. It's just a couple curses. All right, guys, you ready? Here's what I was thinking, Maya, and you tell me if you're comfortable with it, and if you're not, I'll revert to my original idea.
Okay.
Are you comfortable doing like a looser adult version of this conversation, and I can just mark it for adults and bleep out cursing if we curse?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. You just did something just now, and whatever it was, it's louder than you expect it to be. So.
Oh, okay. Let me just check something, because the headphones I'm using, if I'm not moving around, is it good or...
Well, I don't know what you're doing because I can't see you, but...
I'm actually changing my pod right now.
Are you really? Well, go ahead and do that.
I can hold, when I'm not changing my pod, I can just hold my speaker or my receiver thing away from my jacket.
Yeah, that's all. Sometimes if you're wearing a corded headset with like just an Apple headset, if you start moving and that mic hits your shirt, hits your hair or something like that, it makes a sound that I hear that you don't hear.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, cool.
Okay. Great. Riley Link found the pod. Okay. Well, if we can hang on for just a second so I can get this pod on, then we should be good to go.
Maya, I think this is the absolute perfect podcast for you to be changing your insulin pump as it starts. And by the way, I'm recording, so we're good.
Okay, great.
Yeah, you're absolutely fine. This is, it's actually kind of nice. Probably in a few minutes, we're going to stop and do Arden's insulin for her lunch too.
Okay, great. It's perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm cruising a little low too, so you'll probably hear me eat a date here.
That's excellent. I think that's actually Arden's 71, and her blood sugar just shifted to a like a diagonal down arrow.
Yeah.
And so I'm like wondering what's about to happen. I really think she's about to go to lunch, which then I love the low as a pre-bolus, and it's perfect. But
it really works the best. You can never make it happen when you want it to. And then, when it does, you're like, yes, perfect.
I'm winning. Listen, can you talk while you're swapping your pod?
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, for sure.
So I'll lightly start chatting with you here, but, and I don't want to take your focus away too much from what you're doing.
Oh, no, you're good. You're good.
Cool. I loved the way you reached out to me. That idea that somebody, is your husband? Is that who we were talking about? Or boyfriend?
Yeah, my husband and one of my friends, 2 people told me that this was my moment.
So 2 people in your life, after hearing me on the podcast say,
"Yep,
I'm looking for a professional drunk," said, "Oh my God, Maya, it's your turn to be on the Juicebox Podcast."
I know. It made me a little nervous, but
Was there any self-reflection after this happened?
There was a little. But I think the reason that that my husband said that it was my moment was because we've been together like the whole time that I've been diabetic.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we were together in college when I was figuring out how to drink. And so I think, he knows that I actually put some thought into it.
Nah.
But my other friend, that's the one that makes me nervous.
So your husband had some perspective, and he's like, I've actually seen Maia work really hard at understanding how alcohol affects her with her blood sugar. And your friend just went, Maia drinks a lot and she has diabetes. Is that?
Yeah, that is how it went.
Yeah. I can see you thinking, oh, damn.
Mm-hmm.
So, Maia, I'll say it here because people won't know this before. This is going to be part of sort of an After Dark series. We're going to talk to you about drinking today. Later, we're going to talk to a professional pot smoker, and since we're going to call you a pro drinker, and also going to get a male and female adult on to separately to talk about what it's like to have sex when you have diabetes too. So we're going to do this whole little trifecta of adult activities and diabetes. But you and I are going to be a little looser while we're talking about this today. So there's going to be cursing in this episode. It'll all be beeped out. But if you're one of those people who normally lives a life where your kids are listening along with you, or for the few people who tell me that they're like really young kids listen by themselves, which I think is awesome, this is probably not the episode for your kids to listen to. It'll be, marked well in the title, and everybody will know ahead of time. Oh, here we go. I just said to my daughter, she is lunch. And she said, what? And then I wrote, when is sex? So, when is lunch? Sorry.
When is sex?
I didn't do that. Did I do that subconsciously while I was talking about the podcast, maybe?
Must have.
I mean, there are 3 letters in sex and 5 letters in lunch, so. My God. I don't know.
It happens.
She's so helpful. I don't know. Oh, because they did this award thing this morning. So she's not heading to lunch now like I thought she was. So she needs to take in a couple of carbs here.
Yeah, I'm drinking my Juicebox as we speak.
Oh, apparently Arden is going to be too, because she's not on her way to lunch. Also, have you hopped the rails? Are you running away from home on a train?
No, I'm sitting in my car. I teach yoga.
Okay.
And so I'm sitting in my car outside my yoga studio, which is right by the train tracks. But that should be the only train that passes us during our podcast today.
Absolutely.
So that will be good.
That's totally fine. I feel like it adds flavor. Cool.
Yeah. I actually have a great view. I'm right on the water. I'm on the waterfront. I'm in this nice park. It's really nice.
What part of the country are you in?
I live in Washington State, nice. North of Seattle. So I'm up in Bellingham, which is, right in between Vancouver, British Columbia, and Seattle.
Gotcha. And so to start slow, because we're going to get into you and your diabetes for a second before we get to, the other stuff, but any pause at all on your part? Like, I'm looking for stigma. Like, is there any concern? Like, I really can't go on a podcast that people could hear and talk about how much I drink, or do you not?
Oh, no.
About it?
No, not at all.
Good. I don't think you should.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think anybody should feel self-conscious about who they are. But I just didn't know if it was something that gave you pause. If you thought, I don't know if I want to say that out loud. Would you have more reservation saying something private about diabetes or another part of your life, or do you feel like you're just an open person in general?
I think I'm a pretty open person. I don't know. I called my dad when you responded back and had a chuckle about how you saved all your funny questions for the podcast. And but I called my dad and I was like, Dad, I'm going to be on a podcast and it's going to be about how much I drink. Oh, see, there was my low glucose alert. I really don't. And I think the reason is that if you know me, you should probably know most of me, Mm-hmm. So that's always just been kind of my opinion.
Cool. What Maya's referring to is that when she and I went back and forth a couple times because, normally I'm just like, hey, would somebody like to come on? They can talk about whatever they want. But when you were coming on to talk about something specific, as soon as we started chatting back and forth, the questions started popping into my head, and I stopped myself. So I'm like, I'm not going to do the podcast over like Messenger, where I'm like, oh, what about this? What's this like? That kind of thing. So how's your blood sugar? You okay?
Yeah, I'm good. I had like 20 carbs, and I should be all good to go.
Nice. So you changed your pump, stopped the low, and are doing a podcast in your car. That's excellent.
Yeah. Yeah.
See, people, this is for the newer diagnosed people who are just like, I don't understand. It's so overwhelming. Maya's just like, if I had another hand, I could be brushing my hair. So
actually, I just got out of the shower. I'll probably put on mascara while we talk too.
That's excellent. All right. So, Maia, welcome to the show. One of the longer preambles any show is going to have. How old are you now? How old were you when you were diagnosed?
I am 28, and I was diagnosed at 17. So I just celebrated my 10-year anniversary in June.
Congratulations.
Yeah, I made it.
I made it. I'm still here. You are the perfect person for this. I didn't know your age range from diagnosis to now until just now, but you're perfect because you're in your later 20s. So any of the incredibly stupid things you were going to do, you've probably done already. You've figured out which one of those things you're probably never going to do again, and which one of those things wasn't so bad. And you were diagnosed right in a really kind of pivotal age. So, all right, let's talk about that. Were you a senior in high school or a junior?
So I had actually just graduated from high school. I was diagnosed like 2-3 weeks after high school graduation.
Okay. Were you almost 18?
It was a couple months before I was 18. I'm an August baby.
Oh, very nice. And so, okay. So you just graduated from high school. Were you planning on going to college, or what was your next step in your mind?
Yeah. So it's a little bit of an interesting situation. So I actually grew up overseas, and I lived in New Delhi, India for all of my childhood. I moved there when I was 6 and lived there for my whole life. And I had just moved back to the U.S. to go to college. And my parents were going to be staying in India. And I had, classic diagnosis of weight loss and everything. But kind of stacked on top of that was that I was in the fashion industry, and I was working as a model. And so I wasn't in school. I was exercising a lot. I was losing a little bit of weight and toning up. And I was like, man, this is awesome. Like, I never dieted and always was really pretty proud of myself for that. And I just tried to take good care of myself. And so I was like, wow, this is great. They're going to be so happy at my agency that I'm a little bit thinner. And then it just kind of kept going. And I was like, well, this isn't super great. And I knew I had a problem because my aunt threw me a graduation party, and I peed my pants at the graduation party. And I was like, because I was drinking and peeing so much. And I was like, oh my God, this is not good.
And for clarity, not like I got drunk and peed my pants, or I got excited and peed my pants. It just happened. Like, you're like, I have to pee so bad, I can't stop it.
Yeah. Like, and I wasn't drinking that night. I maybe had like a glass of champagne or something, and we were having this like family event, and I was like, okay, this has gone far enough. And, I'd been dating my boyfriend for a while, and he actually lived, where I was moving, and he was part of the reason that I was moving there. And I was planning on going to visit him, and my mom was like, you can't go until you go to the doctor. And I was like, yeah, I probably have like a urinary tract infection, or, I'm taking supplements that aren't meshing with, other medication that I'm taking or whatever.
Yeah.
And I walked in, and they were like, yeah, the nurse, like the doctor wasn't even there. She's like, yeah, you've got type 1 diabetes.
She just knew right away?
Right away. And my grandmother actually knew, which is so unfair. She goes, when you go into the doctor, have your HbA1c checked. Oh. I'm like, oh, okay.
Hey, fancy
you
grandma.
Knew this.
Yeah.
I know, seriously. So they're like, you're going to go drive. We live out in the, or at that time, my folks had a place out in the county, and And so they're like, you're going to go into the city and go to the hospital. And I called my boyfriend, who's now my husband. And I was like, hey babe, they think I have diabetes. I'm going to the hospital. And I was in a kind of unique situation because my best friend in high school was is type 1 diabetic. Mm-hmm. And my one of my first boyfriends was type 1 too. And so I had known both of them at the time that they were diagnosed. Well, maybe I didn't know Brendan when he was diagnosed, but I was friends with Audrey when she was diagnosed. And so I remember what happened. It was like one day she was there and then she was gone and she was like missing for weeks. And then she came back and everything was different. And so I was just really like, oh my gosh, what is about to happen to me? Yeah. But I also had these examples of two humans who like lived pretty normal lives. So that gave me enough perspective to not totally panic.
Right.
And I was in that weird space of like, mom and dad are not going to be in my life in a month. Mm-hmm. You know, they're going to be across the world. So I got to figure this out on my own. And so I was in the hospital for 2 days, and kind of figured everything out. My parents were like, how much do you want me to be involved? And the people at the hospital are like, you're turning 18 in a couple of months. Do you want to go through peds where your parents have to be involved, or do you want to go through this as an adult? And I was like, I want to go through this as an adult. So I'm in a unique situation where if I asked my mom how much insulin I needed to take for a meal, she would have no idea. Right. She wouldn't know how to change a pod or do any of that stuff. So
her perspective,
I think
her perspective is as an adult, as the parent of an adult person who was diagnosed. Yeah,
for sure.
I wonder if it was 6 months earlier, what you would have said, like right before you graduated, like if you would have still felt. It's interesting. Like it's it's really cool that you chose, I'll do it on my own. Did they come with you even though you went through the adult path?
They never went to an endo appointment with me. They were there at the hospital and, you know, being good parents about it, but they never really went with me, but my boyfriend did. So for the first probably 3 years, after I was diagnosed, he was at every endo appointment, every CDE appointment, and pump training and everything with me, which was super cool.
See, lucky guy, really, because, you know, the secret is that guys are always looking for something to be involved in where you look sweet. And so he was like, this is perfect for me. I could just go to these. I'm just kidding.
I know.
But that's excellent because I'm even like, is he much older than you, or are you guys the same?
He's 4 years older than me.
Okay. Because that's the other thing. Like when you, at 17, you're like, hey, I have, you know, almost 18. Hey, I have diabetes. That he didn't go, I'm sorry, you have the wrong number. And then, you know, and was like, oh, I wasn't up for this, but he's got enough adult life in him to not panic when he hears something like that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, you know, I've always been a person where if something didn't matter, I just didn't put any effort into it. You know, like when I was in high school, you know, like if a class, I didn't find an application to what I was learning, I was just like, whatever. And I always did okay. But, you know, I think that really suited my personality, that diabetes really suited my personality, because then suddenly this stuff mattered and I could apply myself to it.
So
and I was like, okay, so the American Diabetes Association, in their pamphlet that they give newly diagnosed type 1s, says that you need a support network. And I'm like, okay, building support network, you know? And so I think that was really helpful. And I'm also super lucky because my husband was trained as a chef, and at the time that I was diagnosed, he was a chef, and he had a restaurant, and we went to the restaurant and we carb counted every meal, every menu item.
Okay.
So I could go and bolus for it. And so like the first, I don't know, I didn't eat anything else except for the first little bit, because I could reliably bolus.
Yeah.
It was great.
Probably helped you put some weight back on too. Nothing like eating
out. Oh yeah.
Yeah, nothing like eating out to gain a couple of pounds.
I know. And it was all Italian food too. So I feel like everyone talks about this struggle with like pizza and pasta and whatever, but that was the first stuff I learned to bolus for. Mm-hmm. So I kind of dialed that in quick, and then, went back and was like, wait, how do I eat a salad?
You did the hard stuff first. And by the way, I bet going backwards from more like carb intensive foods to less, you probably had a similar struggle adjusting from one to the others. Somebody would going from salad to pizza. I don't think it's much different. It's a big adjustment one way or the other, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah. It was still learning a different way, of giving myself insulin for sure.
I agree. You've done a very unfair thing to me here. You've said a lot of really interesting things that don't have anything to do with drinking. So I have to. I'd be, completely remiss if I didn't ask you why you were living in India.
So my parents were teachers, and they taught at an international school there.
Okay.
And when I was born, they were teaching at an international school in Taiwan. And then later on, they moved to India. We lived in the States for a couple of years in between, but they taught at the American school there.
Very cool. And they're not like international jewel thieves who are hiding out overseas or something like that. They're just really teachers, as far as you know.
Not to my knowledge, but if they were, that would be cool.
Yeah, as long as they leave you the jewels, I guess, at the end.
I know, as long as I get them.
And I have to say, too, again, I can't spend too much time on this, which is hurting me inside, but I am going to go back to India for a second before I ask you my second question. How did you find living there? I have friends who have lived there. My wife's visited kind of extensively for work a couple of times, and I'm interested.
I mean, it's kind of an unfair question because I don't know what it was like to grow up where you grew up. I moved there when I was 6, and, it was super cool. One year, my parents got like an elephant to come to my birthday party.
Nice.
Like people always get a pony or whatever, and I got an elephant, and that was super rad. But I don't really know because it was my whole life. I know that it was vastly different than my experience here. And so I think that was an incredible, asset to me.
Right.
Coming back to the States and having this global perspective. And I traveled back to the U.S. frequently as a kid. So I didn't have that like big culture shock when I moved back. But I definitely think that it gave me a global perspective and a lot of gratitude for what I do have, like just on a basic level, access to insulin, because I definitely did get to see a lot of hardship in my life. Yeah. But I also got to meet incredible human beings and travel so much as a little kid. And anyone who says that traveling with kids is not worth their time or money is just needs to reevaluate, because I had so many experiences when I was a little kid that really changed me, getting to see the world.
Well, I guess I have some follow-up questions, and they're not about drinking yet, but hold on. Trust me.
We'll get there. I promise.
Right, yeah. So I guess what's one thing that sticks out to you about India that you don't miss, and something about here that you wish didn't exist?
Well, we'll just start with something that I wish didn't exist, which is the price of insulin, because my parents were still living in India for a few years after my diagnosis, and I would go back and visit them and get my annual supply of insulin for $150.
Wow, for like as long as you needed?
For a year.
A year, geez, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was insane. And it was the same insulin made in the same factory, in the same vial,
Yeah.
It was nuts.
That's something. What about India? Like, so I'll give you a little perspective. One of my daughter's best friends is Indian. She goes home. Well, she doesn't go home. She goes to her parents' home a couple of times a year. Sometimes they go for visits. And sometimes it's amazing. They go to shop for clothes and, to meet with people. And I said to her one day, I was like, Sanjana, what's the worst part about India? Is there a bad part? And she goes, I have to poop in a hole when I stay at my grandmother's house. And I go, say again? And she goes, yeah, you go outside and, dig a hole and poop in it. And I was like, oh, yeah, that doesn't sound good at all. And she goes, it really isn't. And then my wife, when she visited for work the first time, I don't know where she was, in fairness, and what city she was in, but she sends me a message one day, and it just says, I have never seen so many penises in my entire life. And I texted her back and I was like, hey, two things. I think you sent this to the wrong person and I'd like to get divorced. And, and she was like, no. She's like, everyone pees on the street.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, what? She goes, when men are walking, if they have to pee, they turn to the curb and they pee and then they keep going. She's like, it is so pervasive that written on the walls of buildings, it doesn't say no loitering. It says like no urinating. And I was like, oh, that is different. Is this something that does not surprise you?
Well, I mean, this is the thing. I grew up with it. I mean, I started, pooping in a hole when I was like 6. So I remember not doing it. We had a toilet at our house, but I don't know. It was just always there.
Didn't seem that
that was hard for me when I came back, was like, there was a lot more like, oh, you can't just use the restroom wherever you want or whatever. There were things, there was some culture shock, but I always explain it, with the cereal aisle. Okay. So when I was growing up, you could go to this one little store in this big market and they had American food. Mm-hmm. And so you could go to the store and they had Cheerios. You could go buy super stale, expired Cheerios for, like double the price that you'd buy them at a Safeway.
Right.
And when I'd come back to the States, every year there was like a new flavor of Cheerios. And by the time that I graduated from high school, there were 13 different kinds of Cheerios. And I just thought that there were Cheerios. I didn't know that, like, I was like, what is this stuff?
The Cheerios world had grown without you. Can I ask?
Yeah, and that was the rest of the world.
Have you ever almost mistakenly back here in America, like in a flower bed outside of McDonald's or something like that? Or does that never happen to you?
Luckily, that has never happened, no matter how much alcohol I've consumed. That's
what I was thinking. I'm like, it's completely possible that Maia could be drunk in public, think she's in India, and just be like, I know what I need to do.
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, man, that's funny.
I'm so sorry. So here's a good time for a break. Arden's saying lunch soon, so we're going to bolus for Arden's lunch together. Chips. She's asking me what's in there. So I've eliminated some processed foods from Arden's life this week because we're trying to figure something out. And she's not being exactly fun about it. I'm trying to think. Oh, she's going to be so pissed when I tell her what's in. So she has a sandwich and chips, bell pepper, carrots, a little chocolate, and a banana. And I'm so hungry. And I said, she goes, did you give me real food? I'm so hungry. And I said, yes, some. And she goes, like what? And I told her and she goes, so then no.
Aww.
I'll tell you what. If she eats all that, can buy one thing from school. So for now, I think we'll do, let me try to think. Chips, 18, sandwich, 24. What's that? 40, 50, 60, banana, 70. Let's do 40 carbs, 2 hours, and 30 carbs, 3 hours. And then tell me if you buy something else. Sorry about this. It's a little different than it has been. She gets
That's okay.
She's getting like muscle cramps a lot in her shoulders and her neck. And, we've done all of the conventional things that we can think of. It doesn't seem to alleviate it. So sort of in a wild swing, I just removed like processed stuff for a couple of days from her. Like not a lot. Like she still has some like natural potato chips. I know people are like, what are natural potato chips? But there are potato chips that have like very, very few additives in them. Yeah, and
I live in granola land, okay?
I was going to say you're in Washington, right? You've probably eaten a raw potato and somebody's like, it's a potato chip. And you're like, no, it's not. Don't shit in the hole and tell me it's a toilet.
Seriously.
Yeah, exactly. So, diet ends she said, I'm glad we're cursing on this. And she goes, no, I can't because there's nothing here that fits in that f***ing diet. So I said, the diet ends tonight. She goes, so can I get a cookie? And I said, yes. Let's see what the answer is going to be to that. Because I'm starving. So, I think Arden's a real carb kind of girl. You know what I mean?
Sometimes you just need a cookie.
Yeah, no kidding. She did really well, actually. My stomach is eating itself.
Aww.
She's just full of shit. She just loves she said, okay. So anyway, she's just me in like a smaller female body. So she's just being a basically. Finally, some people listening are going to be like, I knew that guy was now he's admitting it. I one time joked that.
Yeah, but you admitted it by calling your daughter a
Did I? It's hard to know what I did right there. I hear what you're saying, though. It's possible I didn't put it right on myself. One time I joked about an episode. I'm like, my ego really got away from me today. And I was so clearly joking around, and somebody left a review that's like, see, he even admitted it.
Oh, that's funny.
India, a different place to live for certain.
So if we want to loop it back to drinking,
okay.
One of the crazy things about me growing up was that I could go out to a bar. So, I don't think, I don't even know what the drinking age was, but there was no restrictions on drinking. So, people had birthday parties at nightclubs, and in high school we would go out to the bar. And my rule from my family was always that I could have a beer, I could drink a little, but I couldn't ever come home drunk. Gotcha. And so that was already like part of my life. Coming to the States, I would like walk up to the counter at the grocery store at 18 years old, try to buy a bottle of wine. And I'm like, shit, I can't do that here.
I'm imagining your parents having a parenting talk off to the side, and they're like, Maya looks, she asked if she could get a beer, and I don't know what to say. And one of them said, we make her in a hole. We should probably let her have a beer if she wants one.
She's earned it.
Yeah. You need to be a little drunk to plant your feet firmly and kind of squat. Hey, you know what? While we're doing this, Maya, can you describe how you do poop in a hole? How does it go exactly?
Well, I think the big thing is that you develop special muscles, and a little more hip flexibility, but you just pop a squat, I mean,
but is
it just like, imagine
you got to stay a little
bear. I think they're ergonomically laid out holes. There's normally like a foot pad on each side. A lot of them are like porcelain.
Yeah.
And there's like a little foot pad on each side, and the hole's a little, behind you, and you just do your business. But a lot of places don't have toilet paper, and they have like a little sprayer, so you use a bidet instead of toilet paper, which I miss that for sure.
And well, first of all, people who love a bidet speak highly of them. And my other question is, there's a custom in India, right? Like you don't shake hands with a certain hand because of the wiping, right?
Yeah, because you use the one hand to clean yourself and the other hand is for eating and greeting.
It's so basically there's so much good that's come in this podcast already. We have not even talked about drinking yet. I in my mind want this subtext of this podcast episode to be does Maya in the woods? Yes, she does. And so,
well, I do that too.
I'm right now picturing the people listening to this at home going, wait, did she say clean themselves with their hand and that's why they don't shake with a certain hand? And like everyone who didn't know that, I'm watching like in my mind right now them process all that. But yeah, that's 100% how that goes.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So I have to ask I have to preface before I ask, right? So
okay.
I'm not a drinker. And I don't just mean I'm not a drinker. I mean, and I've said on the podcast a couple of times, I don't drink. It's not for a moral reason. I haven't had a problem that that I'm staying away from. It has just never really occurred to me to drink in my life. To the point where I always say that I definitely have not had a case of beer in total in my entire life. Like not even that much. And I think I've had hard liquor a few times. which people would consider like, I don't know, whiskey or something like that. I don't particularly dislike it. It just doesn't occur to me. So I am going to be a complete neophyte on this, in a lot of ways. But having said that, and please understand, like, you're not going to get a judgment out of me, but I am asking the question, right?
Mm-hmm.
As an adult now, having the experience you would have had, if you were in the same situation, would you say to your kids, "Hey, it's cool, just have a beer when you go out," or would you?
Yeah,
you would be.
Yeah.
So you don't see you haven't had any, like, there's no scenario in your life where you're like, "Wow, someone should have kept that away from me for a little longer."
I don't think so. I mean, I think my mom had the best torture mechanism ever if I would come home having too much to drink, which was that she would talk to me until I was sober. So it would be like 4:30 in the morning and she's still chatting away and making me engage in conversation about my latest essay that I wrote for school. And it was just torture. So I didn't.
Was she with you, or was she just trying to?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, she was. Okay.
Oh, yeah. She was just trying to make my life, not so fun. But no, that was a really good dissuader.
I don't want to drink too much and be forced to speak to my mom about current events. Yeah, that does make sense. I have no perspective on it. Like, my son doesn't drink at all, and when we talk about it, I do see that. I don't think it's because I told him not to. I think it's because it's just who he is. Like, I look back now and I realize no one told me not to drink.
Yeah.
That never happened in my life. Like, no one ever said to me, "You're going out, don't forget, you're underage, you can't." Like, it just never. I just went my way and you went yours, and everybody goes in their own, I guess.
Yeah. I think that really, if you want to be responsible about drinking, you need to start to drink in places that are safe and not be afraid to ask questions, because I can't imagine being a teenager and getting drunk for the first time and already having diabetes. I already had that experience by the time that I was diagnosed. And I can only fathom that if you had, a parent helping you manage, really helping you manage your diabetes, that would be a really challenging experience. So I can only hope that people and parents feel comfortable having that conversation with their kids, and maybe even helping them figure it out. If, it's like, okay, so how many carbs are in this beer? They don't have carb counts on them.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to figure that stuff out on your own. There's no nutritional facts for alcohol. So I think, being in that space where you have someone to help you figure it out is so helpful.
Yeah. Now, so as you're talking, the serious side of parenting is coming up in my mind, right? Which is, we do this a lot, is we throw kids into situations that they're not prepared for because we don't want to talk about one of the things they need for preparation. And whether that's around sex or drinking or drugs or anything like that, you can't just pretend someone's not going to do something. Like my son drove back to school the other day, and I didn't say, "Hey, be careful driving, because I love you, buddy." I said, "Look, it's raining out, and you drive fast, and everyone drives fast, and please don't follow closely. I don't think you do, but please don't. And here's why." And, like a little more context around it, not just be careful. You know what I mean? Like, you can't just look somebody. I remember my wife would say, when she would go out on a date, her mom would say, "Respect yourself." And that's not direction. Do you know what I mean? That's like your mom's like afraid to say to you, "Hey, well, actually, I guess we are talking pretty freely on this. I think that's your mom saying,
use protection.
Yeah, use protection. Don't every guy that smiles at you. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that kind of stuff. Like, really be respect. But wouldn't it be nice if there was context to that? Like, from a parenting person, like a real person who would sit down. I always have this kind of regret that my mom would talk to me in platitudes. And I wrote I wrote a parenting book, and I spoke about it a little bit in there. But, like, here was a woman who had the benefit of a life's worth of information and experiences, and then she would just tell me this surface shit that wasn't helpful. Like, why not sit down and tell me, yo, one time when I was 35, here's what happened to me, and it was terrible, and here's why, and I think you could avoid it if you paid attention to this. Like, wouldn't that be great to get the benefit of someone's experience?
Yeah.
You know, and so I think I like what your parents did. And I think that if my son didn't have the vibe about him that he had, I would have stepped in and been like, all right, look, I'm not, I don't know a lot about this, but we're going to help you because I feel like you're going to leave this house today and you're going to drink. I don't want to just cross my fingers and hope that all goes well.
Yeah. And I mean, I think worst case scenario is that I think it would have been way worse if I was hiding from my parents. If I was, instead of coming home being like, oh, I'm going to stay out and, go sleep at someone else's house so no one knows. I think that's a trickier path, right?
Yeah. No, I hear what you're saying. And I also hear what you're saying about like having drank before maybe you were diagnosed. You had a tiny bit of expectation about what it was. And you knew how to maintain yourself a little bit. And did you, when you were earlier, like you weren't just a blackout drunk, right? You didn't just like every time you drank, it wasn't till you couldn't see yourself anymore?
No, I mean, I had to talk to my mom if I got that drunk.
Do you think you would have had your mom not done what she did?
It definitely happened. I think like there were those moments when you're young and you don't know, what you're drinking or not paying attention to how much. I mean, it happens where you get really drunk. And of course, now that's like the equivalent of one cocktail. And I could definitely drink that because, I have way more and I'm a, adult who drinks a glass of wine with dinner every night. So 2 glasses of wine isn't going to make me blotto. But yeah, it happened for sure. And I think that, just setting the expectation, the other thing that my parents would do is if I did come home drunk, in the morning, my dad would put on Formula One, which if you've never had a hangover, Scott, but if you've ever had a hangover, the sound of the race cars like droning for hours is like the worst hangover exacerbator on the planet.
Your parents will get a great job in hell one day torturing people. They have all kinds of good ideas.
They're great at it. I mean, they're awesome people. And I think those were really good, kind of passive torture techniques.
Yeah, no kidding. That's I see what you're saying. So they were kind of dinging you along the way, like making sure that you knew what was happening and that they were aware. It's just, I think that it's incredibly important for people to hear. We'll get to the how you manage the alcohol with insulin and everything, but I think it's incredibly important for people to hear who have younger children, because when you have younger kids, most people's expectations are like yours is going to be the one that comes out just perfect. You know what I mean? Like, and some people, listen, some of your kids are such like monsters that you're like, no, it's not going to be my kid. I know my kid's on his way to something else, right? But a lot of people have that feeling, right? Like you have this, like, I have a good plan, we're putting effort in, it's going to work out. But, when kids go to a party and there are 40 and 50 high school kids at a party, 98% of them are drinking. It's not it's not like a few of them are. Like if your kid's the one's like, oh, it's not me. And I'm like, now you're like, oh, but Scott says his kid doesn't. Like, I get that. Like, but there's going to be my kid there and he's going to have a couple friends with him and they're all going to be off in a corner just not understanding drinking at all. And they'll hang out for a little bit and then they'll leave. And the rest of them are at some level of drinking out of control because they don't have any expectation for what that means. Yeah, and so you're going to need to be ready for this. Like if your 16-year-old has diabetes right now, is going out on the weekend, they're like, don't worry, we don't drink. I think it's probably still important for them to hear what Maia has to say about how to manage it. So,
I mean, I'll tell you, my best friend in high school had type 1, and she was out there drinking right next to me. My boyfriend in high school had type 1, and he partied way harder than me.
Good.
They're okay. So it's going to be okay.
They lived through it. Yeah. And so did they know what they were doing back then? Like, were those people who had diabetes for a long time, or were they figuring out drinking with diabetes at the same time too?
I don't know if either of them listen to the podcast, and I don't want to
gotcha.
Make them feel bad, but I would say that now I would guess both of them have a pretty good handle on it. Mm-hmm. But back then, I don't think that they did.
Yeah.
But I also think, we didn't have the tools that we have now, right? Like we didn't have continuous glucose monitoring.
Yep.
So, you know, I think on a baseline level, like just you couldn't look at your phone and see what your blood glucose was, or set your phone alarms super loud so that, you know, if you did get low, you'd wake up. So I think that's changed a lot, especially when it comes to drinking. You know, it used to be kind of you want to ride a little higher, going to bed at night because you didn't have any alarm that was going to wake you up if you went low.
Yeah.
And now you can play it a little bit closer, you know, and set a temp basal and not stress about it too much. But I think, I don't think that they necessarily had it figured out. And neither of them ever had a major issue while I was there. You know, they did well enough.
Well, you're talking even 10 years ago, you really are still speaking about a time with diabetes where the goal was don't feel dizzy, don't pass out, right? Like,
oh yeah.
That's what it looked like back then. I just don't want, I don't want to lose control of myself and pass out. I don't want to get too low. And so staying higher, I mean, if even today, people who are being diagnosed today are being told like better high than low, like all that stuff. And that's still left over from, that was the way, like you just better high than low. And, you know, we'll trade tomorrow for today.
Bull too, because how you feel is so, like, I can tell you that without ever, like, I have no knowledge of any blood glucose value from either of the two type 1s that I interacted with every single day for years of my life. But I can tell you that they were not running, you know, good A1Cs. They weren't feeling good every day. The amount of water that they drank and then the amount of, you know, times they used the restroom in the day compared to me as a non-diabetic at the time. Like, I know those weren't good glucose values. And I don't begrudge them for that, because
it's what they were told.
It was what they were told and what they were taught, you know?
No, I understand.
And even like when I was diagnosed, I think I did the math, and I think I might have started the Omnipod around the same time as Arden. And it was the old, bigger pods. And I was it was like right when they were released pretty much. And I loved the pod, but the tech just was not like that. Original PDM was like, it was like a brick.
Oh, the blue one with the hard, made out of like hard plastic even, right? Like it felt like if you dropped it, it was going to break, and like, Oh,
no, I did drop it and it did break.
It was made out of that kind of plastic. Like when you go to a bubblegum machine and get a ring out, you're like, if I squeeze this bubble too hard, it's good. It felt like that.
It's just going to shatter.
Yeah, I had that feeling about it. No, I hear you.
Yeah. And then I got the first Dexcom, and I hated that. I only wore that thing for like maybe a month and was like, nope, that was a waste of $1,000.
Right. And now which one, what do you use now?
I'm on the G6.
The G6.
And I have the Omnipod.
Right. And complete night and day from those things till now.
Oh, yeah. For sure.
Yep.
For sure. And I think, you know, with those tools, like you can look at yourself or your kid and be like, okay, if you're drinking, like, let's shoot for, you know, you want to be at the higher end of your range. Well, for me, which would be around like 140 if I'm going to bed and I'm not setting a temp basal. But honestly, the biggest thing for me in the last year has been starting to loop. If you think about my best blood glucose day, this is hilarious. I love this. My best blood glucose day since diagnosis was the 4th of July this year on loop.
Okay. And
I think
had a drink or two maybe?
Oh yeah. I was drinking. I had Jell-O shots. I had, you know, we had a couple bottles of champagne. It was great. But the thing is that what loop enabled me to do on that day versus on a regular day was I'd already done a lot of deep, like, settings testing. And so my settings were really dialed in, and I just input my carbs and I didn't touch it. And it was the first time where I'd never, like, since I started looping, because I started in June, it was the first time where I didn't futz with it because I was so used to like, like little temp basal here, a little extra insulin there, or whatever. And I just input my carbs and let loop. And it was amazing.
Your settings are very like right on then.
Yeah, they're doing pretty good. I did a lot of testing though. Like I think my husband would tell you that I was just the biggest pain in the ass because I basically, only ate every other day for like 3 weeks trying to figure out what my settings were.
So you like get a setting right without eating, like a basal testing situation, and then you would like, all right, tomorrow I'm going to try it. And then you try it, like that didn't work. You'd make an adjustment, get it straight again, and then go back and try again.
Yep.
That's really cool.
Yep.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I like that a lot. All right, so listen, we're so far into this now. How do you handle take an algorithm out of this scenario for a second and just be a regular person with diabetes? When do you start thinking about drinking and your blood sugar? Like if you're going to be at dinner at 6 with a glass of wine, is that something you have to think about ahead of time, or is that different than I'm going to go to a party at 8 and when I walk in, I'm grabbing a glass and I'll probably have a glass in my hand of something all night long?
I think honestly, I think one of the gifts of alcohol is that the thought can happen when you're holding your first drink in your hand. Most of the impact, when we're talking about drinking and blood glucose, it's all after the fact, right? It's that you talked about this with Jenny in your recent episode, and you can go back and listen to some of the science about why this happens, but you get low later. So unless you're drinking something where you need to pre-bolus, or if you're starting out of range, getting yourself into your desired range is helpful. But I really think the nice part about alcohol is that the tricky part is delayed. So you can say, okay, so I'm going to have this drink. I'm going to give myself my insulin for whatever I'm drinking. And if it has carbs in it, and sometimes you don't, I think for me, a light beer, I'm not bolusing for. Now everyone drinks those spiked seltzers. I don't bolus for those. They only have, 1 to 2 carbs in them. A red wine, I don't normally bolus for. Dark beers don't have a ton of carbs, but some of those like lagers and ales will be a little bit carbier. So I might give myself, a unit here, a unit there. But what I'm really looking at is like, what time do I start drinking and how much do I drink? If I'm only having one drink, my liver's not going to be overwhelmed. I'm not going to need to set a temp basal later. I'll probably just, if it's not, like a rum and Coke with however many carbs for your Coke, I'm not going to give myself any insulin for it. And I'm not going to change my thought process later in the day. If I am drinking a little bit heavier, let's say I'm drinking hard alcohol with a no carb mixer. So that's no insulin in, but a potential negative effect on my blood glucose or decrease in my blood glucose later on. Then I'm saying, okay, well, I had my first drink at 9:23 and 4 hours from there, I'll start to see a little decrease in my blood glucose. And I actually, so because I was diagnosed between high school and college, one of the big things for me was I wanted to figure out how to be a college kid. I wanted to figure out how to just be like any other kid. And if that meant I wanted to go out and party or go on a weekend trip to Lake Tahoe or whatever it was, I wanted to be able to do that. And we didn't really have the Dexcom back then. And so I sat down on this big party weekend. It was like 4 days of like drinking and water skiing and, playing on the lake. And I was kind of running a little low on insulin, and I didn't want to be like giving myself too much insulin and then, correcting lows and using more insulin than I needed. So I was like, I'm going to figure this out. So I took a shot of vodka and checked my blood sugar every, 15 minutes for 4 hours and saw what it did. And I was like, okay. So at the end of that experiment, I said, hey, if I take 4 shots of vodka, I get a free PB&J in 4 hours.
Okay. I like that. You're pre-bolusing for a snack later. But
pre-bolusing for a snack.
Yeah.
So set the alarm on your phone and be like, hey, if you're not running a CGM, set an alarm on your phone and say, I had 5 drinks and I'm probably going to be tipsy or asleep. So I need to have a snack. Mm-hmm. And I think now it's easy because just like your basal testing, you can test what different drinks do to your blood glucose, right? Like you can say happy hour is the perfect place to do this. It starts at 2:30 p.m. You have a drink. It's hours before you're going to eat. You can have 1 beer and look and see what it does to your blood glucose and learn from it. Right. And I think it's just like everything else, right? It's like, don't beat yourself up if you don't get it right, but take what you learned. And this is the tricky part about drinking, is that you have to remember that you learned something because your inhibitions are down and you're not paying attention.
Now, what did I learn from this
experiment
with the vodka? I can't remember.
I know. I can't remember. So I upped it from 4 shots to 10 shots, and now it's all getting fuzzy.
Well, you know what? It's interesting what you just said. Let me jump in for a second. It occurs to me that what you did was just perfect. And it would work too with food if food didn't keep you high for so long afterwards. Like,
exactly.
I just realized that if food impacted as quickly and went away like alcohol did, it would take us all like a week to sit down, have a great snack every night, and figure out every one of our favorite foods. But it's the fact that food keeps you high afterwards that stops you from doing that experiment.
Yeah, you don't get the low. Right.
Yeah.
And then, you can't test it with like with vodka, you don't have any carbs, so there is no initial spike. Mm-hmm. Right? If you don't have a mixer, it's just that drop later.
And so even without insulin for vodka, there's a drop later.
Yeah.
And so can you tempt basal back earlier to try to avoid it, or is it unavoidable?
It's just a little far out. So like what I've found is that if I tempt basal in advance, I wind up high because I'm too aggressive. It's too soon. And it's not like everything you drink is different too. So if you have, you might have 2 different kinds of cocktails or whatever, and then that's going to impact you a little bit differently. So I haven't found I've had a lot of luck with that. However, what I have had a lot of luck with is just decreasing my basal a little bit overnight when I'm going to bed. So if I just decrease my basal, if I know I've got some insulin on board and I've got some alcohol on board, I'll just decrease my basal a little bit overnight, and I normally wake up in range.
So I have 2 questions around that. Is the biggest concern that you'll get really low and be drunk at the same time and can't help yourself? Is that like if there was a thing that you're worried about, would that be the worry?
I think that's honestly for me, my biggest concern is impaired decision making of like, do I input my carbs correctly for the Wendy's burger and Frosty that I'm getting as my drunk munchy food on the way home, when I make the Uber pullover? Am I bolusing right for that? And the only times I've gotten myself into any sort of trouble has been when I gave myself like way too much or not enough insulin, except for there's this one story that I will tell you. So this is a great diabetic in the wild story. Mm-hmm. I was at a water ski tournament, which are, if there's any water skiers out there, crazy parties. They're just huge parties with like a side of water skiing.
Yes.
So I was at this water ski tournament, and my Omnipod PDM, I dropped it and it shattered, and it like exploded. And I was like, I don't know what to do. I don't have any bolus insulin. Mm-hmm. I have nothing. I was talking to my husband and, then boyfriend, now husband. And I'm like, what do we do? And he's like, well, none of us can drive.
We're a little stuck here right now. Yeah. We're all drunk. Like, we could call a cab. It's going to cost, $100 to get a cab out here and get you home, but we can do that. Or you can not drink, or,
or, not eat anything until someone's sober enough to drive. Like maybe we can find someone who's planning on going home. And we're sitting there chatting and this kid comes up, Connor, and he's like, I'm type 1, right? Like, what do you need? Did your meter break? And I was like, no, my pump broke. And he's like, I have an idea. So he had an extra infusion site and my blood glucose was high. It was, I was like probably like 250 or something. And he had an extra infusion site and he just had his one pump. So he popped his infusion site on me, which I do not medically recommend this, and gave me a bolus with his, with his pump.
Don't worry. At the beginning, we're going to say that nothing you hear on the podcast is advice.
It's not advice.
Yeah.
You're also going to say that we're going to swear, but that was fucking cool. Like that was so cool. We're still friends. And it was like this great moment of camaraderie, and then in the morning, he gave me a little extra hit for breakfast and it was really great. Because I still had my basal insulin from my pod. Right. I just couldn't bolus.
You basically did the diabetes version of like guy in the action movies, mask gets knocked off underwater and they share like a scuba mask on the way back up again.
That is exactly what we did.
That's very cool. I love that.
Yeah.
And you were able to think of it drunk. So you are a professional drunk.
I told you.
How did you find Jenny's conversation about alcohol in that episode? Did you find it pretty accurate to your experiences?
Yeah, I did. I think there's this thing that happens where, as we age, we become more reasonable and you're not going to drink like you did when you were young. And I think you can blame that on diabetes, or you could start that sooner because of diabetes. I think generally being type 1 just makes you slightly more responsible than the average human, and take a little bit more personal responsibility. But I also think that it doesn't have to get in your way. And my number one advice for anyone ever, especially if you aren't familiar with alcohol and diabetes, is I make my DD, my designated driver, my designated diabetic. And I give them glucagon. I give them a tube of frosting to put in the glove compartment of their car. And I let them know that they're responsible if something happens to me, just like if something were to happen to anyone else that night, but if something happens to me, this is what you need to look out for. And I'm probably not too drunk. I'm probably low. So, that in college was a game changer for me. Always having someone who knew what was going on, where if something happened, they could help me. And I rarely used it, but I definitely did hand my CGM off to people and was like, hey, if this alarms, I am not hearing it right now. Like I am in some other universe and I need you to like come get me.
I was wondering, is there a difference that someone's ever said to you between like, hey, low looks like how does low look different from drunk or vice versa? Or are they hard to distinguish between?
If you don't know what you're looking for, it's really hard to tell. And I will liken it to this. If you are not diabetic, you probably have experienced low blood glucose before and thought you were just starving.
Yeah. Or pissed, right? Or angry sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, the minute you have type 1, you begin to distinguish between the feeling of low and the feeling of hunger, right? They're two separate feelings, and they have a lot in common. But for most people, they're the same feeling. And I think for most people, if you look at a drunk person, oh, they're drunk, but it's going to look really similar to type 1s. I think like a lot of times in the news, if a type 1 has a seizure while they're driving and they get into an accident, they get characterized like a drunk driver, and I think it's that like cognitive mismatch. If my husband looks at me, he can tell if I'm drunk or low,
right.
Mostly because he does. And mostly because if I'm low, I am sweating profusely and I'm shaky and my voice is, wobbly. And if I'm just drunk, I'm just, like slurring and having fun.
Yeah, happy mind.
But I don't have that like core shakiness that comes with a low.
Yeah.
So I also think for me, I can tell I don't lose hypo awareness when I'm drunk. I can normally tell.
But can you care?
That's tricky.
Okay.
But normally I can treat a low when I'm drunk. Sometimes I can't catch a high. A lot of times I can feel when my blood glucose is trending upwards, and I can't feel that so much when I'm drinking. But where I struggle is in the morning, especially now as I'm aging and my hangovers are getting worse. In the morning when I have a hangover, which is when I'm most likely to be low, I have a hard time distinguishing my hangover from a low.
Okay.
Because, you think about it, you're like, I'm shaky, I'm nauseous, my vision is blurry, my head hurts. I don't even want to look at any food or anything to drink right now. I just feel terrible, and that's how I feel when I'm hungover. So it's really the same. That's something where I start to lose a little bit of my awareness. Yeah. But at that point, I'm sober, so I can make good decisions.
Do you have any tips for not being hungover?
I always just stick with one thing when I drink, and it also makes it easier to bolus. If I can stick with the same type of alcohol, similar type of mixer, that normally works really well.
Yeah.
I think if you don't want to be hungover, you just shouldn't drink that much traditionally. But I also just think that's a good guideline. Mm-hmm. And they always say, beer before liquor, never been sicker. So
right.
Liquor before beer, you're in the clear.
I bet you a drunk person thought of that. Now,
I bet.
I have to tell you, it's again, I genuinely mean absolutely no judgment. As you've been describing all this, and I'm listening to the joy in your voice, I can't imagine, like, everything you've said. I think, oh God, I would never want to do that. Like that sounds like the biggest thing I could come up with, that I was like, oh wow, drunk girls in bikinis at a lake sounds fun. But like that was the best part I could come up with anything. I wonder what it is in me, because I really am not an uptight person at all. As a matter of fact, I do a pretty good job on this podcast of reining myself in ways you guys might not really know. I just can't, like, I can't imagine, like, I don't like the idea of being out of control of myself. I already think I say enough stupid stuff when I'm not drunk. Like, I always feel relaxed. Like I'm happy most of the time. But see, that's just it. That's it. Okay.
People drink because they want to drop their guard. And if you're a person who walks around with your guard down and you're relaxed and you're happy and you don't need to, like, get your brain out of work mode. I think for so many of us, we are so plugged into school or work or life, and we have a hard time unplugging.
Gotcha.
So to, at the end of a day, be able to sit down and have a glass of wine and just make that go away. Mm-hmm. I think that's the drive, right? And I find people who are really relaxed and easygoing like you, they tend to just not need a drink at the end of the day because they can choose to not be stressed about their workday.
That makes so much sense. I was listening the other day to the Howard Stern show, and it was out in Los Angeles for some special show, and in studio was Snoop Dogg and Seth Rogen together. And they made smoking weed sound like the best thing on the planet, to the point where as you're listening to them, you're going, I should try this. Like, this seems like such a good idea. You know what I mean? Like, no differently than when, like, somebody's telling you, like, oh gosh, I used to have a problem with this, but now I take vitamin D all the time and it's straightened right out. And you're like, damn it, I'm going to get some vitamin D. This is like, that was like the vibe it had when it was over. I was like, and then when it ended and they weren't there talking in my ear anymore, I thought, I don't want to be high. I was like, it was just like, it was so funny how quickly I went from like, oh, that sounds like such a great idea. Because it really, they just described it in such a wonderful way. Like, when you're talking about drinking, I'm like, this sounds wonderful. And then the minute you kind of wind down, I'm like, oh, all those drunk people. Like that's really.
Well, but here's the other reason to drink.
Right.
Because if you're drinking, you can't tell that everyone around you is also drunk.
That I believe. Yeah, no, I know that.
So you don't get that, like, deep frustration with the drug people around you.
Yeah, and that's amazing because I have an amazing tolerance for people. But when you lose that much of yourself, I'm just like, oh, stop talking. Or sometimes you can get somebody right in the right space and you can chat with them and they're just endlessly entertaining to me because they're not so gone that they can't keep their thoughts together, but they're just doing so many silly things. Like, oh, it's like having a puppet show in front of me.
Oh yeah,
it's very much fun.
For sure.
Do you see a time in your life where it stops, or do you think it's just part of who? Like, can you imagine like a 68-year-old Maia at the lake, just like drinking and water skiing? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, is there?
Oh yeah, that's the goal. That's the dream.
It's excellent. That really is.
I mean, that's the dream, and I don't think like every year I probably drink less than I did the year before, but I'm a social drinker. My husband and I love to cook and eat and drink. And, it's nice to have a glass of wine at dinner. It's nice last night we got elected to the board of our neighborhood association. And so, we all sat around, everyone who got elected, and we had a beer together. And it was like, that's just great. And it's fun and it has camaraderie with it. And I also don't have to drink. Right now, my husband and I are getting ready to have a baby. And so I'm emotionally preparing myself to not drink for, an extended period of time. And so I think, it doesn't have to be a part of your life for you to have fun, but for us, it just is part of the way that we live our lives.
Yeah.
And I love sitting down with my parents and having a glass of wine. I love, going and floating the river with my dad and drinking a case of beer. It's super fun and it's wonderful.
It feels communal to you. Like
it does.
Right. Do I seem uptight? To you when I say, oh my God, water and beer seems like you're trying to drown yourself to me? And it's funny because I really am two different people inside. Like I have very uptight feelings about some things. And then there are some things I'm just like, oh, I don't care. Like, I don't care that you drink and float on a tube. I have no problem with it. I would never try to talk you out of it. But for my personal self, I'm thinking that sounds like a recipe for disaster. And it's just, obviously it's not, you're doing very well and everything's fine. You figured it out. And you know what you're doing, obviously. I just there's weird things. Like I just have I don't know what it is. I have no bad stories. My parents weren't alcoholics, like nothing weird. Like I've never had one reason for me to tell you this, but I was 13 the first time I went to a party where there was drinking, and I went into this party and I was milling around a little bit and I'm trying to talk and I realized nobody's here to talk. And I'm like, okay. And they were drinking. And I swear to you, 15 minutes later, I found my way upstairs. I found a telephone. I called my dad and I was like, you got to come get me. I'm like, I don't belong here. Like, that's how it felt to me. I was like, this is not the right place for me. And I left. And I think that was probably like one of the few times I've ever been in that scenario ever. It's just very strange how, because what you're saying, again, to me right now, you're Seth Rogen and Snoop Dogg rolled up into one. I'm like, Maia is making a strong case for me to have a glass of wine at dinner tonight. And I'm feeling like it's such a great idea. But I know if I went, I have wine in my house. It's so that I can hand it to other people when they're here. But I always go, I don't know, take one. Like, that's just, take the one out you think is right. But I know that I won't do it. It's so weird. I'm now wondering what's wrong with me, to be perfectly honest, in case you're wondering where my brain is at the moment.
I mean, I know plenty of people who don't drink, and I think you just have to be the person who is the relaxed person, who's not, if you don't need it, you don't need it. And if you had it, then maybe you might know that you would like to have like the feeling of having had a few drinks. But I just think, at the end of the day, you know yourself. And if you're listening to your body, I think that's another thing about diabetes and drinking specifically, is that as a type 1, you learn your body so much better than like a muggle, right?
Yeah, no, for sure.
And so I think you develop these spidey senses for when things are going wrong in your body and things aren't right. And it makes it really easy to be like, okay, that's my last drink.
Yeah.
You know, and that comes from self-awareness, right? People who aren't type 1, they develop that too. But I think we just innately have it because we spend so much time asking ourselves how we feel.
It isn't.
So I think that's part of it too.
It feels important. I want to say two more things because I know you're gonna have to go. But I'm
good. I've got time.
It feels incredibly important to me to point out the difference too between, like you just said something like, I know when it's time to stop and I just stop, which is a great indication that you're drinking the way you mean to be, that you're not, that you don't have, I guess there people probably go back and forth on it. For me, alcoholism seems like a disease. And I know alcoholics who their face could be on fire, but they would still just keep drinking. Like if it was there, they wouldn't stop. But you have the ability to just say like, oh, cool, I'm done now, and I'm done, and that's it. And I guess even that's a comfort to you. Like that you don't. I guess if you were an alcoholic, you'd be in a different scenario. You wouldn't be having this conversation like this. So, but it is, because I can feel people in my minds listening and going, drinking's not funny because my dad's an alcoholic or I'm an alcoholic or something like that. I want to be clear. That's not what we're talking about right now. Do you know what I mean? Like I'm not talking about that. And so I do feel like some people could kind of commingle those two ideas. To me, they would be two completely different conversations.
Yeah, for sure. And I definitely, my grandfather was an alcoholic and my mom never really drank. So, because her dad had a drinking problem. And it's been really interesting to see as, me and my sister have gotten older and we're both social drinkers. My mom was always the person who would like open a beer. She liked it, but she would never finish it. And now to watch her like have 2 glasses of wine or have make a Moscow Mule for herself at the house because she is interacting with social drinkers because that was never on the table for her, right? She didn't know that was a way that you could do it.
She was afraid to drink. She thought she'd end up being an alcoholic.
Yeah, because the only example she had of somebody who did drink had a problem. And that doesn't mean that everyone who has alcoholic parents should go out and start socially drinking. But
I wonder if I've been avoiding this for no reason.
Seriously.
It's not Maia's goal to like create a whole bunch of alcoholics out of people who've been holding really tight their whole life. But it's a great point though.
But if you don't have to go have a bottle of whiskey. You can have a Manhattan and see what happens and set yourself up for success. Like, okay, we're going to try and figure this out. It's the same as anything else. And if you go slow, you'll figure out what works for you. And maybe that's having one drink at a time.
Yeah.
Where the risks are low.
Right. If you would have just said to me, do you know what a Moscow Mule is? I think I would have guessed a sexual position you saw on a weird old porno. Like, I don't know what I would have said exactly. I don't think I would have guessed the drink, just in case you're wondering. I was like, fascinating.
Did you Google it?
No, I'm just sitting here listening to you.
It's ginger beer and vodka with lime.
Okay. If this it's a shame because the title of this episode is going to have to be more descriptive, because if it didn't have to be, it would totally be called Moscow Mule, just so you know. I would have 100% go with that. I really appreciate this, by the way. Like, you seriously are, this is a void in this space that I can tell from the position I'm in, that no one ever, this is the kind of stuff no one ever speaks about. And if they do it in tight circles. You know what I mean? So then everyone else doesn't get to hear about it. I think that what I learned here from you today is that I need to be clear with Arden that if she's going to drink, we need to talk about it first. I'm not just going to pretend she's going to end up being like my son or like me or something like that, because of all the reasons that you outlined, and that we're going to have to sit down and figure out how to make these different alcohols work with insulin and that. Because even as I asked you earlier, I said something that was so like, oh, couldn't you just set a temp basal? But that was me not realizing that temp basal would need to be 3 hours into you drinking. And how are you really going to be like cognitive about it at that point? Like, do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
4 drinks into your party, you're not going to be like, you know what I need? I need a temp basal decrease of about 50% for, I'm going to say, about 3.
See, but this is where Arden is lucky, right? If she wants to go have a beer, she can be like, hey, Dad, had my first beer, set my temp basal in 3 hours.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. And it's so...
Remote override, JoJo.
You're like my Snoop Dogg with drinking at this point is what I'm realizing. Seriously, so what's the rest of your day look like? You haven't been drinking while we're talking. You're going to work? Right?
No. It is it's like 9 a.m. here, so
Gotcha.
no drinks yet. I had a cup of chai this morning.
Very nice.
I'm going to go teach a couple yoga classes, and that's kind of what the rest of my day has in store. So, yeah.
Cool. I have a question about that, if I could. It's
Yes.
nowhere near drinking, and I actually have 2 questions. Did you hear the episode that I'm doing where it's going to be 4 times with a person who's pregnant? We did their first after their first trimester. We're going to do after the second.
Yes.
Do you like that
So
idea?
exciting. I love it.
Good. I'm glad.
Yeah.
And Arden is supposed to be starting up yoga, but she wants to start in the house. Is there a way for her to do that? Like, sort of get into it on her own?
Yeah, there's a lot of like different kinds of apps. YouTube is a really good resource, especially if she's working on something specific. You can hop on YouTube and search like, yoga for shoulder mobility or yoga for back pain or whatever. And there's a million options.
Okay.
There are also like subscription services that you can do online that have, series that you can follow where you have lots of different classes to try. But you can definitely, find a great yoga practice at home. I think it's a really wonderful way to start because it can be intimidating to walk into a room with a whole bunch of other people who know what they're doing. And you're like, what?
No,
you told me to
agree. Yeah. Okay,
you want me to put my leg behind my head, and I can't do that.
I can't do that, and I don't know any of you, and no, thank you.
I know.
I would completely agree. It's hard enough to walk into a gym and start doing something that you're on your feet for, or seated on something that looks like it means to be sat on to done, like on the floor on a mat, having never done it before. I think that's kind of her impediment with it right now. I think she might be embarrassed, but that's why I was asking if there was a good way that you thought of.
Yeah, but I also would say, like most yoga instructors, any yoga instructor who's worth going to is going to be so excited to have her in their class, right? I think I love having new students. I love working through their injuries and figuring out how their body works and moves and how we need to accommodate for their individual body. And that's something you can't get when you hop online. You can get the poses, right, and figure out what's down dog, what's, chaturanga, but having someone to work with you and figure out your body, especially since she's an athlete, is so helpful.
Cool. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you were terrific. I really, first of all, tell your friend and your husband they're 100% right. You were the right person. You were the right person for this. Not just because of your drinking, but because of your ability to talk about it and how open and clear you were. Really, really appreciate this. You took something that I have absolutely no context for and gave me context around it. And I think you did that for a lot of other people too. Really well done. Thank you. After every episode, I take a moment to thank the person that I've spoken with, but maybe no more big. What the am I saying? It might be, how come I can't talk? Mother. In this situation, I mean it times 100. Maia came on to talk about something that some people might judge her about. And she knew that going into this, and that really is brave, because she's trying to bring good information to the people living with type 1 diabetes. So I commend Maia for coming on, and I want her to know how much I appreciate it. Last couple things, if you're looking for Juicebox Podcast merchandise or something to wear for Diabetes Awareness Month that'll start a conversation about type 1 diabetes, check out juiceboxpodcast.com, scroll down to merch. And as you heard me say earlier, I would like to keep this After Dark series going a little longer. I'm looking for a smoker to come on and talk about balancing type 1 diabetes with pot, weed, ganja, grass. What do you kids call it nowadays? Anyway, looking for somebody who has type 1, who smokes regularly, who can kind of, talk about it in an open way. And I'm looking for 2 adults, one male and one female, so we can get both perspectives, who are comfortable coming onto the show and talking about with type 1 diabetes. I want to know all about the psychological part and the mechanical part and everything in between. The stuff that maybe people don't think about that you know about. You know, like what's it like to bump your nose into a CGM when you think you're going to bump it into a penis? Okay. That's pretty much it. See you next week.